There are some stories that stay with you, not because of the details we know, but because of the ones we never will. They linger in the background of our thoughts like a faint echo, the kind you can't quite place, but can't ignore either. The case of Mary Paye is one of those stories. It is a haunting chapter from the past, filled with unanswered questions, half-remembered truths, and shadows that seem to grow longer with each passing year. When we think of true crime, we often picture scenes with clear timelines, tangible evidence, and suspects neatly lined up. But this is different. This is a case where every answer seems to lead to another question, where the trail goes cold, just as you think you're getting close to the truth. It's a case that has sat quietly for decades, gathering dust in official files, but never truly leaving the minds of those who remember Mary, and those of us drawn to the mysteries history refuses to solve. Mary wasn't a name that made national headlines in her time. She wasn't a celebrity, nor a person of great political influence. She was an ordinary woman living an ordinary life. Until she wasn't. And perhaps that's part of what makes her story so chilling. If something like this could happen to her, it could happen to anyone. It began on what should have been an unremarkable day. A day when Mary's life should have followed its usual pattern. Instead, something happened, something sinister and irreversible, that would set off a chain of events ending in tragedy. By the time the dust settled, Mary was gone, and the people who loved her were left in a fog of grief and disbelief. Over the years, theories have come and gone. Some believe the answer was always right there, hidden in plain sight. Others are convinced something far stranger and far darker was at play. But the truth? It's still out there, somewhere, buried beneath time, silence, and maybe even a deliberate cover-up. In the minutes ahead, we'll walk through Mary Paye's life. The day everything changed, the investigation that followed, and the haunting possibilities that remain. And as we do, I invite you to reflect on this story with me, to sit with its uncertainties, its quiet horrors, and its stubborn refusal to be neatly explained. Because this is more than just an unsolved mystery. This is the story of a life stolen, and a truth that still hides in the shadows. Before the tragedy, before the headlines and speculation, before her name became tied to words like mystery and unsolved, Mary Paye was simply Mary, a daughter, a sister, a friend, and a woman trying to make her way in the world. And it's here, in the quiet, everyday moments of her life, that we can begin to understand who she was, not as a victim of a crime, but as a living, breathing person with dreams, habits, and people who loved her. Mary was born in the late 1930s, in a small Midwestern town where everyone knew everyone else. The Paye family wasn't wealthy, but they were close-knit, the kind of family where Sunday dinners were a tradition and neighbors were greeted by name. Her father, Samuel, worked long hours at the local mill, while her mother, Ellen, kept the household running with a steady hand and a warm heart. Mary was the middle child of 3, sandwiched between her older brother, Charles, and her younger sister, Ruth. From a young age, Mary carried herself with a quiet confidence. She wasn't the type to demand the spotlight, but people noticed her anyway. Maybe it was her warm smile, or the way she listened when you spoke, as though your words mattered more than anything else in that moment. She was the friend people confided in, the one who could be counted on to keep a secret. By her late teens, Mary had developed a love for books and music. She spent hours reading in her room, her shelves lined with both classic literature and dime store mysteries. In the evenings, she would sit by the record player, letting the sounds of Billie Holiday and Nat King Cole drift through the house. It wasn't unusual for her to hum quietly as she cooked or worked on sewing projects, a skill her mother had taught her that she turned into a side hobby. Mary wasn't just thoughtful. She was practical. After finishing high school, she took a job as a secretary at a local insurance office. The pay wasn't extravagant, but it was steady, and she took pride in doing her work well. Co-workers remembered her as polite but not shy, someone who could hold her own in conversation without ever seeming overbearing. She kept her desk neat, always had a pen handy, and was known for bringing homemade cookies into the office just because. Outside of work, Mary had a small but close circle of friends. They would meet for coffee at the corner cafe or catch a matinee at the old theater downtown. She wasn't much for wild nights out, preferring instead the comfort of familiar places and familiar faces. There was a steadiness to her, a kind of quiet reliability that made people feel at ease. Family remained central to her life. She often visited her parents, helping her mother with chores or sitting on the porch with her father as he smoked his evening pipe. Her younger sister, Ruth, would sometimes stay over at Mary's small apartment in the city, especially during school breaks. The two shared a sisterly bond, full of laughter, teasing, and the occasional disagreement, always followed by reconciliation. Romance, as far as anyone knew, had not yet played a defining role in Mary's life. She had gone on a few dates here and there, but she seemed more interested in building her independence than rushing into marriage, a stance that, at the time, was somewhat unusual for a woman in her 20s. Friends would later recall that she wasn't opposed to the idea of settling down, but she wanted to be sure about the person before making that kind of commitment. What stands out most, though, is how utterly normal her life was before it all changed. Mary paid her bills on time. She went grocery shopping on Thursdays. She attended church most Sundays, sometimes joining the choir if they were short of voice. She remembered birthdays, sent thank-you notes, and made casseroles for sick neighbors. She wasn't the sort of person you'd expect to vanish under mysterious circumstances, and maybe that's what makes her story so haunting. It's important to see her in this light, as someone living an ordinary life, because it underscores the cruelty of what happened next. There were no warning signs, no ominous premonitions, no sense that she was in any sort of danger. She was simply moving through the world, doing the things she had always done. And then, one day, she didn't come home. When we read about cases like this, there's often a temptation to see the victim only through the lens of the crime, to reduce them to the moment of their disappearance or death. But Mary's life was much more than that. She was the sound of laughter over morning coffee, the careful stitch in a hem, the warm loaf of bread brought to a neighbor's door. She was the quiet joy of a Sunday afternoon spent reading by the window, and for the people who knew her, that's the Mary they remember, not the headlines, not the police reports, but the person she was before the world took her away. As we move forward into the events of the day she vanished, keep this image of Mary in mind, because once you understand the life she lived, you begin to understand the magnitude of what was stolen. It was an ordinary Thursday, or at least it seemed to be. March 14th, 1963, a day that began like so many others in Mary Paye's life. The early spring air was crisp, the sidewalks still damp from the rain that had passed through the night before. In the city, people hurried to work, their breath visible in the cool morning light. For Mary, the day began quietly, but by its end, her name would be etched into a mystery that still lingers more than half a century. Later, 7:15 Mary's neighbor, Mrs. Clara Jensen, saw her leave her apartment building wearing her usual work attire, a pale blue blouse tucked neatly into a dark skirt, her hair pinned back. Clara recalled later that Mary looked calm and cheerful, waving briefly before heading down the street. She carried her handbag on her left arm and a small paper bag that, Clara assumed, contained her lunch, 8 a.m. Mary arrived at the insurance office where she worked as a secretary. According to her co-worker, Harold Bates, she seemed perfectly normal that morning, greeting everyone with her usual warm smile, settling at her desk and typing up correspondence for the branch manager. Nothing about her demeanor suggested she was troubled or distracted. 10:30 a.m. A small but curious moment occurred mid-morning. Harold remembered that Mary stepped outside to make a phone call from the public payphone across the street, something she rarely did during work hours. He didn't hear the conversation, but noted that when she returned, she seemed slightly quieter than before. Not upset exactly, just thoughtful. This detail would later become one of many small, unexplainable fragments in the larger puzzle. 12:05 p.m. Lunchtime. Mary usually ate with two other women from the office, but that day she told them she had an errand to run and would grab something to eat later. Witnesses later placed her at a small diner about 6 blocks from her office around 12:20 p.m., sitting alone in a booth by the window. The waitress who served her said she ordered a cup of coffee and a slice of apple pie, but didn't finish either. She seemed distracted, glancing toward the door several times as though expecting someone. 12:45 p.m. Mary left the diner. A shopkeeper down the street claimed to have seen her standing at the corner, speaking briefly with a man in a dark overcoat. The description of the man was vague. Mid-40s, average build, wearing a fedora, but this would become one of the most discussed sightings in the case. The shopkeeper couldn't recall if they shook hands or exchanged anything, only that their conversation lasted less than a minute before Mary walked away. 1:00 p.m. Mary was due back at work, but never arrived. When she failed to return by 1:30, Harold assumed her errand had taken longer than expected. But when the afternoon passed without any word from her, concern began to grow. 3:15 p.m. The office manager tried calling Mary's apartment, but there was no answer. By this point, Harold recalled feeling a strange unease. Mary was not the kind of person to disappear without explanation. 5:05 p.m. Work ended for the day, and Mary's coworkers walked home in the fading light. Her absence was now impossible to ignore. Harold passed by her apartment building on his way home, noting that her curtains were still drawn, and there was no sign of her. Inside. 7:00 p.m. Mary's younger sister, Ruth, called the apartment after their mother mentioned she hadn't heard from Mary in several days, something unusual, since Mary often phoned to check in midweek. When the call went unanswered, Ruth decided to take a bus into the city to check on her. 8:15 p.m. Ruth arrived at Mary's apartment and found the front door locked. The landlord agreed to let her in after she explained her concerns. Inside, everything seemed in order. The bed neatly made, breakfast dishes washed and stacked, Mary's favorite cardigan draped over the back of a chair. Her handbag, however, was missing, the same one Clara Jensen had seen her carrying that morning. One detail stuck out to Ruth immediately. On the small kitchen counter sat the paper lunch bag Mary had left with earlier that day. Inside was an untouched sandwich and an apple. If Mary had taken her lunch to work, why was it back here? Had she returned home at some point that afternoon without telling anyone? And if so, why had she left again without her coat or gloves, which still hung neatly by the door? 9:30 p.m. By now, worry had turned to fear. Ruth contacted the police to report her sister missing. At first, officers suggested Mary might have gone to visit a friend or decided to stay somewhere overnight. But Ruth insisted this was out of character. Mary was reliable to a fault and would never disappear without informing someone. The man in the dark overcoat at the street corner remained the last confirmed sighting of Mary Paye. Multiple witnesses described seeing her walking purposefully in that direction. But from there, the trail seemed to vanish. No one remembered seeing her board a bus or enter a store. It was as if she had simply stepped off the curb and dissolved into the crowd. The rest of the night passed in a blur of unanswered calls and restless pacing Friends and family began reaching out to anyone who might have seen her. The next morning, police took a formal missing persons report and began their search. In hindsight, the events of that Thursday seemed to move in two distinct halves. The first, the familiar, orderly rhythm of Mary's morning. The second, a series of subtle but disquieting deviations from her usual routine. The uncharacteristic phone call, the solitary lunch, the meeting with an unidentified man, the return of her lunch bag to her apartment. It's a sequence that invites questions but refuses easy answers. Because something happened between 12:45 p.m. and the time Ruth arrived that evening, something that altered the course of Mary Paye's life forever. The investigation into Mary Paye's disappearance began in earnest the morning after she was last seen. The moment the missing persons report was officially logged, the case moved into the hands of Detective Frank Delaney, a 17-year veteran of the city's police department. Delaney had handled his fair share of missing persons before, but something about this case felt off to him from the start. There was no obvious reason for Mary to vanish. No history of instability, no romantic entanglements her family knew of. No debts or legal troubles. Police began by retracing Mary's steps from the moment she left work for her lunch break on March 14th. The small diner 6 blocks from her office confirmed her visit, and the waitress, Gladys Moore, repeated her earlier statement. Mary seemed distracted, glancing toward the door every few minutes. She left without finishing her pie or coffee, stepping back into the street at approximately 12:45 p.m. The shopkeeper who saw her speaking to a man in a dark overcoat was re-interviewed. His description was frustratingly generic: mid-40s, average height, no distinguishing scars or features. The man's identity was never confirmed. Still, Delaney considered him a person of interest. Though not yet a suspect, officers canvassed the area between the diner and Mary's apartment, speaking to bus drivers, store clerks, and pedestrians. No one recalled seeing her after that brief street corner conversation. Patrol cars combed nearby alleys, parks, and riverfront areas. Detectives visited hospitals and morgues in case Mary had been injured or worse. Nothing turned up. The search of her apartment yielded almost nothing. There were no signs of forced entry, no struggle, no missing valuables aside from her handbag. That handbag became a focal point. Inside it would have been her wallet, keys, and identification. Without it, she could not have returned home that evening. Locking the door behind her, unless she had been let in by someone she trusted, or unless she had a spare key hidden somewhere, the lunch bag on the counter continued to puzzle investigators. If Mary had left with it in the morning, why was it back? Had she stopped home between 12:45 and the time Ruth arrived, only to leave again? And if so, why? Police interviewed Mary's coworkers extensively. Harold Bates, the one who saw her make the unusual phone call from the payphone, insisted she had seemed perfectly normal that morning, though quieter after the call. He could not recall her mentioning any appointments or plans. Her family confirmed that. Mary was close to them and typically called her mother midweek. Ruth described her as cautious, not the type to walk with strangers or take unnecessary risks. Neighbors, including Mrs. Clara Jensen, repeated what they'd already said. Mary had left the building in the morning as usual, and no one saw her return during the day. Clara was certain of that. Her window overlooked the front entrance. The first serious lead involved the man in the dark overcoat. Detectives showed photographs of known local offenders to the shopkeeper and the diner waitress, but neither could identify him. Police appealed to the public through local newspapers, asking anyone who had seen Mary or this unidentified man to come forward. A handful of calls came in, but most were dead ends. One woman claimed she had seen a man matching the description boarding a bus with a woman in a blue blouse that afternoon. But the driver of that bus swore no such passenger had been aboard. Another lead centered on the mysterious phone call Mary made at 10:30 a.m. Unfortunately, payphones in 1963 did not track call records. Unless the person on the other end came forward, the recipient would remain unknown. Police speculated it could have been to arrange a meeting, possibly with the man later seen speaking to her, but without evidence. It was conjecture. It's important to remember that in 1963, forensic science was a very different world. There were no CCTV cameras to trace a route, no cell phones to ping locations, no DNA analysis to test items from her apartment. Investigators had to rely almost entirely on eyewitness accounts, which were often hazy and inconsistent. Fingerprints could have been useful, but nothing in Mary's apartment appeared out of place or suggestive of an intruder. The lunch bag was checked for prints, but only Mary's were found. The local newspaper, the Evening Chronicle, picked up the story within 48 hours, publishing Mary's photograph alongside the headline, "Secretary vanishes on lunch break. Police seek clues." Readers were struck by how ordinary she appeared in the photo, neatly dressed, smiling softly. The idea that someone like her could vanish in broad daylight unsettled many. Soon, the case became a talking point in coffee shops and office break rooms. Some speculated she had run off with a secret lover. Others whispered about a possible abduction. Still others believed she had met with foul play at the hands of someone she knew. As media attention grew, so did the number of bizarre tips. One man swore he saw Mary boarding a ferry that afternoon, bound for a nearby coastal town. When detectives followed up, they learned the woman he'd seen was another passenger entirely, a teacher on her way to visit relatives. Another caller claimed Mary had been spotted in a roadside diner 50 miles away, traveling with a man and 2 small children. That tip, too, unraveled quickly when the woman in question was identified and confirmed not to be Mary. The most unsettling false lead came from a local drifter, who told police he had overheard 2 men in a bar talking about getting rid of a secretary. When pressed for details, he admitted he had been drunk at the time and couldn't recall which bar it was, or even the exact day. Some witnesses contradicted one another entirely. While the shopkeeper was certain Mary walked away alone after speaking with a man in the dark overcoat, another claimed to have seen her get into a light-colored sedan just minutes later. Detectives searched for such a vehicle, but found nothing. These contradictions frustrated Delaney. He knew memory was unreliable, especially when people felt pressured to provide helpful information. Still, every conflicting statement chipped away at the clarity of the timeline. By the 3rd week, public patience began to wear thin. Mary's family voiced concerns that police weren't moving quickly enough. Rumors spread that the department had quietly ruled out foul play too early, treating the case as a voluntary disappearance rather than a crime. Detective Delaney pushed back against these criticisms, insisting they were pursuing all avenues. But it's undeniable that after the initial burst of activity, the investigation seemed to lose momentum. New leads slowed. Press coverage moved on to other stories. Still, a few strange details remained, details Delaney couldn't shake. The unreturned phone call, the lunch bag's reappearance, the man in the overcoat, the possibility, however faint, that Mary had returned home during the afternoon without being seen. It was a case built almost entirely on shadows, fragments of sightings, brief conversations, incomplete memories. And in the absence of solid evidence, the truth about what happened to Mary Paye slipped further from reach. The investigation had stalled. But for Mary's family, the waiting and the wondering had only just begun. Many believe the simplest explanation is also the one that fits most naturally into the gaps we can see. Mary Paye was taken that afternoon by the man in the dark overcoat, a stranger who stepped out of the crowd. spoke to her briefly on the corner, and then, in a quiet moment, turned a routine walk into a disappearance. It's the theory that makes the fewest leaps: a single eyewitness sighting, an unattended handbag, an untouched lunch returned to the apartment. Together, they sketch a scene where opportunity and danger met on a busy street. And Mary paid the cost. If we unpack that common narrative, the motive seems straightforward. Predatory abduction is often opportunistic. A woman alone, visibly distracted, pausing at a payphone, joining a diner alone. These are the moments an opportunist watches for. From the investigator's standpoint, robbery, sexual assault, or simply a violent impulse could explain why someone would approach and then remove Mary from public view. In a city in the 1960s, with few cameras and slower public communication, the chance to grab someone and vanish into a vehicle or a shadowy alley would have been more practical than it sounds to us now. The means line up with that motive. The man in the overcoat allegedly arrived in a place where the crowd thinned, a corner between the diner and Mary's apartment, and witnesses placed them together for less than a minute. If someone had a car waiting, or a nearby accomplice, they could swiftly move her from the curb to the passenger seat without prolonged struggle. A convincing voice, a false pretense, an urgent message, help with directions, or even the simple physical dominance men can exert over an unprepared woman would be enough to create the immediate opportunity. From this angle, the missing handbag becomes forensic shorthand. Whoever removed Mary from the scene also took her purse. Either to control her or to obscure her identity afterward, there's also contextual support. True crime studies show that many disappearances like Mary's begin with a single unremarkable exchange. A nod, a smile, a brief chat that masks a violent intention. The public's reaction at the time, shock that someone ordinary could be taken, further buttressed the abduction theory. It satisfied a need for a clear antagonist and an actionable explanation. Find the man in the overcoat, and you solve the case. But there's something that doesn't quite add up. For all the neatness of that theory, the physical and testimonial evidence resisted being tied together in a clean narrative. No car was ever identified. No credible witness placed Mary inside a vehicle. Several claims that she boarded buses or traveled out of town were disproved. The handbag's absence is puzzling under the abduction hypothesis as well. If an abductor wanted to remove Mary quickly and anonymously, why take the one item that could most readily be traced back to her? Or, conversely, why leave it behind if their goal was to make her disappear? The lunch bag left on her kitchen counter complicates things further. It suggests she may have returned home at some point that afternoon, or at least that someone had access to her apartment after she left. Facts that an opportunistic street abduction does not easily explain. Eyewitness testimony, too, is a double-edged sword. The shopkeeper and the diner waitress both remembered the man in the overcoat, but their descriptions were frustratingly generic. Height and hat, posture and pace, hardly enough to sketch an identity. Other witnesses gave conflicting accounts, some insisting Mary walked away alone, others suggesting she had met with someone she knew. Memory is fallible, especially under stress and in crowded places. The more the police relied on sparse, inconsistent descriptions, the more the abduction theory felt more like an emergent story than a proven fact. Then there's police procedure. In the early days, the squad treated several leads as peripheral. The unexplained payphone call was never traced, and the lunch bag was quickly cataloged but never yielded clues. If Mary had been taken in a hurried abduction, one might expect a flurry of corroborating sightings. A strange car, a call to a friend, a sudden disappearance reported by someone else. Instead, the trail thinned into conflicting notes and dead-end tips. That silence raised another possibility. Perhaps the man in the overcoat was a red herring, a convenient focal point for a community desperate for an explanation. So what do? The obvious answer. We owe it weight because it fits many of the immediate facts. A last confirmed sighting, a missing handbag, and a lonely figure seen speaking to her. It accords with how opportunistic abductions commonly unfold and gives us a suspect silhouette we can picture. But the gaps, the missing vehicle, the returned lunch bag, the shaky eyewitness descriptions, the lack of follow-through evidence, keep nagging at us. They force us to ask harder questions. Was Mary targeted by a stranger, or did someone she trusted play a role? Did she go home and then leave with someone she knew? Or was the man in the overcoat simply an incidental passerby, whose presence has taken on more meaning than it should? Many believe the man in the overcoat is the obvious answer. But when you hold the facts up to the light, something about that picture blurs. The theory is plausible. It is also incomplete, and that incompleteness is why this case continues to haunt us. If the man in the overcoat theory is the tidy answer, the unsettling alternative is the one that resists closure altogether. The idea that Mary Paye's disappearance wasn't the result of a random street abduction, but something quieter, more deliberate, and possibly connected to someone already in her life. It's hard not to wonder about the details that feel oddly domestic. The lunch bag placed neatly on her kitchen counter, the door to her apartment locked from the outside, and no sign of a struggle inside. These aren't the hallmarks of someone being dragged away in a moment of panic. They suggest, instead, a return home, however brief, after she was last seen. That single detail reframes the timeline entirely. If Mary came home after her encounter on the street, then either she left willingly with someone else, or someone gained entry to her apartment after she was gone, possibly to cover their tracks. Both possibilities make this theory unsettling because they point toward a degree of planning and familiarity. Friends told police that Mary had recently been more withdrawn. She'd canceled 2 social engagements in the week before she vanished. While nothing about those cancellations was suspicious at the time, people get busy. Some of her closer friends admitted that Mary seemed preoccupied and distracted, as if something was weighing on her mind. Could it be possible that she was meeting someone privately on the day she disappeared? One of the most curious pieces of information comes from a neighbor who claimed they heard footsteps in Mary's apartment around 4:30 p.m., long after she'd last been seen publicly. The neighbor didn't see her face, just shadows moving under the door and a muffled voice. But when police checked, they found nothing disturbed. This report was never fully corroborated, but it lingers because it implies that either Mary returned home alone or that someone else had her keys. Then there's the payphone call. We know Mary stopped to use a payphone shortly before her final confirmed sighting, but the number she dialed was never made public. Investigators were either unable to trace it or chose not to reveal who was on the other end. That secrecy has fed speculation for decades. Was she calling a friend, a family member, a romantic partner, or someone she was meeting in confidence? Another oddity lies in the lack of urgency in the early investigation. Police seemed slow to treat her case as a possible crime, leaning instead toward the idea that she'd left voluntarily. That attitude, common in missing person cases of the era, also raises the question of whether someone subtly influenced the investigation's pace, intentionally or not, giving the trail time to grow cold. In some fringe, but still plausible versions of this theory, Mary's disappearance is linked to a financial or personal dispute. She'd recently taken out a small personal loan, though records don't indicate why. Could she have been pressured by someone she knew and agreed to meet them to resolve it? If so, that could explain why she was seen talking calmly with the man on the corner, if that man wasn't a stranger, but someone she already trusted. Even more unsettling is the possibility that Mary never left the city at all. Without modern forensic tools, an apartment could be thoroughly cleaned and belongings quietly removed. If her disappearance was orchestrated by someone with both access and time, The lack of public sightings afterward makes a grim sort of sense. What makes this theory so chilling isn't the violence it suggests, it's the intimacy. An opportunistic stranger can vanish into the anonymity of the city. But if Mary's disappearance was arranged by someone in her circle, it means the truth has been sitting in plain sight all along. Someone might still be out there, carrying the knowledge of what happened that day, quietly living a normal life. And yet, like all the theories in this case, there are gaps. There's no hard evidence tying any known associate of Mary's to her disappearance. The neighbor's account could be mistaken. The payphone call could have been entirely innocuous. And without any recovered remains or confirmed possessions, the trail remains speculative at best. Still, when you weigh the quiet details, the lunch bag, the locked door, the unhurried timeline, it's hard not to wonder if the story we've been told all along is missing the person who mattered most. Not the shadowy man in the overcoat, but someone who could walk into Mary's apartment without her fear, take her away without drawing attention, and then disappear her life as neatly as that lunch bag placed back on the counter. The unsettling truth is that sometimes the danger isn't a stranger waiting in the street. Sometimes it's the person who already knows where you live, what you'll do next, and exactly how to make sure no one ever finds you. In the days immediately following Mary Paye's disappearance, there was still hope, a hope sustained by the idea that she had simply taken time away, that she might walk through her apartment door at any moment. But as the weeks stretched into months, the optimism began to fade, replaced by a gnawing uncertainty that would define this case for decades. The trail began to cool far sooner than anyone wanted to admit. The initial search efforts, canvassing the neighborhood, interviewing witnesses, checking hospitals, produced little beyond the now famous sighting of Mary speaking to the man in the overcoat. Without additional leads, police found themselves chasing shadows. Every day that passed without fresh information made the case that much harder to solve. One of the most frustrating elements for investigators was the absence of physical evidence. Mary's apartment showed no signs of forced entry, no fingerprints that didn't belong, and no blood or clear indication of a struggle. Her personal belongings, handbag, wallet, and keys, were all gone, presumably taken with her, which complicated the search. There were no abandoned items to suggest she'd been taken against her will, yet no confirmed sightings to indicate she'd left voluntarily. The payphone call she made shortly before her disappearance became a focal point. But this lead collapsed under the weight of incomplete records and possible police withholding of details. In the pre-digital era, tracing calls required a narrow window of time, and by the time investigators secured the necessary information, any potential trail was gone. That unanswered question, who was on the other end of that line, has haunted the case ever since. Public frustration mounted as the months turned into years. Local newspapers ran follow-up stories with headlines like, "Where is Mary Paye?" and "Case still open, but leads run dry." Letters to the editor revealed a divided community. Some believed Mary had met with foul play. Others speculated she'd left to start a new life. Police statements were cautious, emphasizing that the case was active, but offering little in the way of concrete progress. For Mary's family, the lack of closure was a constant ache. Friends described her mother as a woman who never stopped glancing toward the door during gatherings, as if expecting Mary to walk in. Birthdays and holidays became bittersweet rituals, moments meant for celebration, but marked by the absence of a daughter, sister, and friend whose fate remained a question mark. Over the years, several family members passed away without ever learning what happened, a fact that adds a quiet layer of tragedy to the case. Now and then, faint glimmers of hope would appear. In the mid-1980s, police received an anonymous letter claiming to know where Mary's remains could be found. The tip led to an intensive search of a wooded area outside the city, but nothing was discovered. In the 1990s, a woman contacted authorities, claiming to have seen Mary living under a different name in another state. That lead, too, proved fruitless. Each false alarm reopened old wounds, only for them to heal into deeper scars. The introduction of modern forensic techniques in the 2000s offered a slim possibility of progress. Cold case units began re-examining long-dormant files, hoping DNA analysis might turn up something new. Unfortunately, with no confirmed crime scene and no recovered remains, there was nothing to test. What evidence did exist? Witness statements, grainy photographs, typed reports remained as it had been since 1978, incomplete, inconclusive, and frustratingly static. There's also the matter of the man in the overcoat. Despite composite sketches and repeated public appeals, he was never identified. Witnesses could only agree on broad details: average height, dark hair, late 30s or early 40s. Without a name, he became a ghost in the case, his significance impossible to measure. Was he a harmless passerby caught in an unfortunate coincidence? Or was he the last person to see Mary alive? That question remains unanswered. The emotional toll of decades without resolution cannot be overstated. Cases like Mary's live in a strange limbo, too cold for active pursuit, too human to ever truly forget. Friends and family have described it as grieving in circles, an endless cycle of hope, speculation, and renewed despair each time the story resurfaces in the media. For the investigators who worked the case, many of whom are now retired or deceased, it remains one of the most haunting files they ever handled, even today. The mystery retains its grip on those who stumble across it. Internet forums dissect the known facts, armchair detectives debate theories, and every so often, a new thread of speculation emerges. But the core truth remains stubbornly elusive. There are no fingerprints, no confirmed sightings, no definitive timeline beyond the afternoon she vanished. Just a locked door, a lunch bag, a payphone call, and a shadowy conversation with a man who has never been found. And so, the trail remains cold. Not in the sense of forgotten, for Mary Paye's name still circulates in whispers and web searches, but in the way a case grows resistant to light, the way time seals over the smallest cracks where answers might have once been found. If the truth exists, it's hidden deep, waiting for someone with the right question, the right memory, or the right piece of overlooked evidence to finally bring it into the open. Until then, her disappearance stands as one of those haunting, unresolved stories that refuses to fade, a mystery preserved in the silence between what we know and what we will never know. Thank you for joining me as we revisited the haunting and still unsolved disappearance of Mary Paye, a case that has lingered in silence for decades, yet refuses to be forgotten. If you've ever heard of this story, or if you have your own thoughts on what might have happened, I'd love to hear your perspective in the comments below. Your insight might just spark a new conversation around this cold case. If you'd like to explore more quiet, haunting investigations like this, stories of forgotten crimes, unanswered questions, and mysteries that still echo through time, consider subscribing. Together, we can keep these names and cases alive, ensuring they're never lost to history. Thank you for watching and for remembering Mary today.